None of us can escape the impact of this global pandemic. It affects us all. If you're a pastor or a church leader, you have special responsibilities. In this series, Leadership in Crises, today I interview Dr. Ed Stetzer, who is the director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. His insights, his analysis, his suggestions and recommendations, these are some things that you'll want to listen to and note, and I'm sure pass on to your colleagues and friends and associates. I'm Brian Stiller. This is Leadership in Crises. I'm joined today by Dr. Ed Stetzer, who is director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton College. Ed, good to have you here today.
Well, so thankful for you, thankful for World Evangelical Alliance. Looking forward to our conversation.
You've been doing a lot of studies on what's going on, at least in the U.S., but I'm sure even globally. And you've looked at how we work our way through these pandemics, these crises moments. What have you been learning?
Well, a couple of things. First, we can look right now at the state of U.S. pastors. We have actually 3 studies that we're drawing from. One is one we did in partnership with Evangelical, which is kind of a local ministry, well, I guess it's global, but we did a convenient sample of 1,500 church leaders. Barna has done a study, and I'll draw some from that, and Lifeway Research has done a study. And what we're finding is that pastors are not yet feeling the full economic crunch. Part of that may be because we have a disproportionately high population that uses online giving. They're feeling some, don't misunderstand. But I think that's more to come. As you know, we've seen just huge percentage of unemployment. We've seen 6 million people on unemployment, filing for unemployment benefits in the States on April 3rd. We see churches struggling technology to get online. And finally, we see churches trying to engage in the mission and seeking to make much of Jesus in a very, very scary time of illness and death.
You've looked at the various phases that we work our way through as we tackle these huge issues. What have you been finding?
Yeah, so we actually talked, one of the things we did is Josh Laxton, who works with me here at the Billy Graham Center, we actually put together something of a resource that I think might help with that. And you can kind of take a look here. And I'll make this available to people if they want to go to this whole PowerPoint they can have. Just go to edstetzer.com/WEA, World Evangelical Alliance. And we talked about leading through the coronavirus crisis. And I'm going to skip some parts of the PowerPoint. You can see here, you can see here, you can see here. But want to focus on 4 ways of leading through this crisis, and to remind almost everyone in most places, with the exception of Italy, Spain, some parts of Europe, New York City, at the time of this recording, which is April 2nd, I think all of us need to realize that we're here. We're down at the bottom. Here's where we are today. That cases are about to come, and they're going to, in all likelihood, overwhelm your healthcare system. They're going to, and we think about right here, we look at this healthcare system capacity. Let's talk globally. When this gets rooted in sub-Saharan Africa with undeveloped healthcare systems, when this is in more remote parts of Brazil, we're going to see some very substantive crises here. And even here in some, like in the U.S. and Canada, where you are, Brian, we have homeless populations. We have people who are incarcerated. We have places where the opportunity to shelter in place, to stay away from others among the poor, marginalized people do not exist. So, but we should remember that for most of us, we are not yet in the crisis, but that crisis is just weeks away. So phase 1 in the crisis is to pause and pivot. And let me say what I mean by that. You got to pause. Your church may need to go online if you have the capacity to do that. Your church may need to meet in smaller groups if you have the capacity to do that. And we'll talk about some of the religious liberty implications of that in a minute. But right now, churches and probably everyone watching this is obviously watching this online. So you have some capacity to get online, get on a phone, somehow to get that out. So that's it. And for a lot of people, there was a crisis of that. A lot of churches were, what are we going to do? And what I would say to you right now in places like Spain, Italy, places like New York City, you need to be way beyond this phase. If you're still making this a crisis about streaming your church online, you are not paying attention to the real crisis in your community. So pause and pivot, but we can't stay there. We've got to move from there. And for most of us who are watching this, the next phase is actually going to be to move to prepare and plan. So wherever you might be, that might be the next step for you, is what are we preparing? What are we planning? Because we've got a nation, whatever it may be. You may be in Ghana, you may be in Vietnam, you may be in Brazil, you may be in Canada, but you got a nation going to be drowning in hopelessness if it's not already. Certainly that's what we're seeing in Italy and in Spain. We surveyed, we actually interviewed pastors from Spain and Italy, and one of them is weeping, speaking about how their skating rink is being turned into, ice skating rink, it's being turned into a morgue and more. Mm-hmm. So we've got to be ready, and to prepare and plan matters right now in this time. Now, again, I got more in the PowerPoint. Again, you can go to edstetzer.com/WEA. My name is spelled Stetz. That's for the Canadians, ZER, if you want to follow along with that PowerPoint as well. But again, phase 2 has some coming social realities: overloaded hospitals, increased number of deaths. We talked some with our Italian pastor friends about funerals and how they do them. There's things that are coming culturally, right? In my case, this is something I've prepared for U.S. pastors in particular. Our nation is still deeply divided. You may experience the same as well where you are. So we sort of went through these questions. You see me just flipping through the PowerPoint. I'm going to give all this to you again with no problem. But we're talking about some of the pastoral care practices, but it's not just about your church, right? It needs to be about your church. The one another's of Scripture, that's a real thing. We want to make sure that we are doing good to all people, especially the household of God. So who in your church is most vulnerable? Who in your church has a pre-existing or a comorbidity factor? And how do you engage them? Now, the good thing is most of us around the world have some level of phone technology. And so if someone can't get out, then they can be at home working the phones, calling other people in your church and seeing how they're doing and encouraging them in the midst of this. And 2, don't forget, it's not just about your church. It's also going to be related to good neighbors. We have a tradition in many parts of the world called bingo, and this we call a good neighbor bingo board. How can you teach people in your church right now to engage? I'm going to leave it up there for just a minute, to engage their neighbors, right? What can you do with some of these moments to engage your neighbors? We even listed some things that missional best practices that churches are doing. Again, you don't want to read all this on the screen. edstetzer.com/WEA, all the stuff, including several videos, a video of me going through this whole PowerPoint if you want to use it with your church staff or more, because we've got to get to phase 3. Phase 3 is engage and execute. So let me say, if you're a pastor or church leader, you're associated with us through the World Evangelical Alliance, can I just say to you that right now, if you're not in the midst of the crisis, you still got a few weeks, maybe in places we got a couple of months. We're seeing slower spread in some places, but this is a novel coronavirus. That means that nobody's immune and no place is going to experience a virus-free existence. Remember, the Spanish flu went to the Solomon Islands. So there was no place, I shouldn't say no place, there were some villages and a few places that cut off access for 2 years. But in very few places will this not be a reality. You need now to have paused and pivoted. That's phase 1. You got to be looking at phase 1 in your rearview mirror, preparing and plan for the crisis that I believe will be the greatest crisis of our lifetime globally. Now, people in Syria, they're in the middle of Syrian civil war. They've probably had a greater crisis personally, right? We think of the tsunami, the Boxing Day tsunami. There are places where people have experienced greater crises, but never will we have had a global crisis like this in our lifetime. The last time was probably in World War II from a disease. It was the Spanish flu. And keeping in mind, the Spanish flu is far more deadly than COVID-19, but nevertheless, we're going to experience that kind of challenge. So phase 3 is to engage and execute your plan. You got to take care of the people in your church. You got to be on mission in your community. You got to recognize that there's a multifaceted reality going on here, and you need to be ready for it. I've tried to write on this a little bit in my own context. We have a kind of a national newspaper of sorts called USA Today. There's really not a national newspaper in the US, but that's the closest thing probably for some that we get to it. So I wanted to share a little bit about what I thought Christians should be doing. And so here's an article that I wrote. Let me share it with you. The title is Removing the Coronavirus Mask. Hopefully, let me see, make sure you can see that.
Yeah, we can see it.
What's that? Is it on the screen or no?
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah.
Okay, good. So removing the coronavirus mask, this crisis will reveal us as Christians. And I kind of went through and I wanted to point to, everyone sort of pointed to now this idea that Christians in the midst of plague, and I did as well in knowing that USA Today readers, mainly non-Christians, but I talked about Eusebius in a 4th century epidemic, by the way, which is far worse. Let me just, a quick aside. We are far less accustomed to plagues today than Christians have been for 2 millennia. And so this plague was far worse. And what Eusebius says, hopefully you can see the highlight, says that the Christians served others, and as a result, Eusebius concludes, the Christians' deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. That's my hope, is that ultimately people will see our actions, because right now, pastor, church leader, denominational leader, WEA partner, right now, you're preparing for a crisis that might be, it's probably 2 weeks away in Chicagoland where I live, because we're right behind New York City. But where you are, you need to be preparing for that crisis. It's coming soon, and it's going to be the greatest crisis of our global lifetime. Not necessarily you personally, you individually. Let me share with you back to the PowerPoint here as well, so we can take a look at phase 4, because there is a phase 4 that I want us not to miss, right? So phase 4 is pointing us to and I go through several things about how to engage, and I'll skip those. But phase 4 is recover and reemerge. We will get through this. We have in the past, the Spanish flu, but far much more, right? And so we know that there are epidemics and outbreaks around the world all the time. Some of you are far more familiar with them than I have been where I live. So I want to encourage you to not be discouraged. But my hope is by the time we come out of this crisis, that the Christians will have served well. And can we do that risk-free? No, we can't. There are shortages of medical equipment. We now call them PPP here, personal protective equipment, right? So for us, we're already starting to deliver food to people who need it, right? Because all of a sudden they can't shelter in place, homeless populations, and more. So Christians, in the midst of this, for 2 millennia, have shown and shared the love of Jesus in the midst of crises. And I think this is our moment. We have the security in Christ that if we get sick, Romans 14:8, if we live, we live for the Lord. If we die, we're with the Lord. In all of those cases, we have a unique calling. This, I believe, is our moment. But get out of pause and pivot. Get to plan and prepare. Be ready to engage and execute. And then how long will it take till we recover and reemerge? We don't really know. The Spanish flu took 2 years, and then by November 1918, people just stopped getting it. In December, it was gone, and we haven't seen it again for 100 years. So what happens is we build up herd immunity, or maybe we'll have a vaccine. But the reality is it's probably going to be with us a very long time, just not as pandemic as it is right now. So we don't know how we fully recover and reemerge. We don't know how church practices will change yet, but what an opportunity for us to show and share the love of Jesus.
And this is terrific. And I hope those that are watching, you'll see on the bottom the address. Go to edstetzer.com/WEA and pick up this material. Ed, as governments have been clamping down on crowding, people coming together in crowds, in some places the governments have simply said to churches, to mosques, to synagogues, please don't have your Friday or your Sunday or your Saturday service. Some pastors resist that on the assumption that they should not bow to government decrees. How do you see that?
Well, I understand it. I understand the impulse. Here's what I would say. I would raise a significant vocal protest if somebody said, hey, it's okay for concerts to meet and large conferences to meet, but not for churches to meet, or churches, synagogues, and mosques to meet for that matter. Or gurudwaras or temples or whatever it may be. I mean, I think religious liberty for some means religious liberty for none. But if there is like it is here right now, if there is a sense that nobody's meeting in large groups, I think we need to hear that caution and respond accordingly. I would remind you that there's a group in South Korea that has been described in various ways in the media, but a religious group in South Korea that made up for half of the cases in South Korea in one cluster from one pretty secretive religious group. And so what we're seeing here already in the US and Canada is stories coming out where this congregation met and now a whole bunch of people are infected and it's spreading through the community. Here's what I want you to hear, right? Your neighbors not only do you show them love by not meeting right now, but your neighbors will actually have and hear and have a negative perception of you riskily meeting together with flouting rules and directives. And here's what I would say. I get it, and let me say, across the WA, we know that there are different levels of religious liberty around the world. And could a totalitarian government in a place where you are use this as an opportunity to specifically persecute churches? Yes. And but that's probably not what's happening right now. And what I would say is, you should look and see if mosques, if you're a majority Muslim country, mosques are allowed to meet, but churches are not. How might we protest that moment? If you're in a country where concerts and big conferences are going on and you can't meet, but keep in mind that the most frequent place around the whole world where people meet in larger groups is actually for worship, religious worship. So everybody, doesn't mean the majority of people even practice religion, but literally billions of people come together in synagogues, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, and more. And they come together once weekly. And in doing so, that is exactly the most dangerous thing to do right now. Now, in 6 months from now, we had a mayor of one of our major cities, New York City, say that if churches meet, we're going to shut them down and they may never reopen. Super unhelpful comment. I'm one among them saying you should never be threatening to permanently close churches. We have in this country the First Amendment. Many of you have different things. There's charters, there's rights of freedom. And what I would say is, I think people during fearful times say foolish things. That mayor of that city, of New York City, said a foolish thing. So, but here's the deal. One of the things I think really, you gather to give the focus on Jesus. That's what we want to do. We want to focus on Jesus. We have a lot of pastors in our country, not a lot. We have a handful of pastors in our country who are taking the focus off Jesus and bringing attention to themselves by flouting rules and putting their neighbor at risk. And let me just say to you, I get the religious liberty concerns. If 6 months from now, this virus has burned through and dissipated, and we find that restrictions are focused on churches and places of worship, you will see me, Brian, and you too, I know, at the front of the line saying this is a restriction of religious freedom. Right now, this is really not a restriction of religious freedom. And for a short time, we can make it through this together.
And when God calls us to love God with all our heart, soul, and mind, and our neighbor as ourselves, I suspect that this inclination to love our neighbor is to care for their well-being. And we ask in this virus-laden moment, what does it mean to care for my neighbor?
Yeah.
Ed, across the world, of course, the pandemic is at various stages. In some places, it's peaked, and it's in the aftermath. Some places, it's just beginning to peak. And in many parts of the world, it has yet to show itself, apart from very modest numbers. So as you think about pastors and church leaders across that globe in the varying situations of severity, what would you have to say to a pastor in Zimbabwe or in Serbia or in some other part of the world as they face the issues in their society? They are shepherds of a flock. They are responsible for a Christian community. What would you want to say to them today?
First, I would say that it's probably coming your way. And because we know that from the past, right? We know that from the Spanish flu epidemic. Again, no place other than a few tiny villages was spared. I mean, everywhere. And I think you should be ready for that. Now, it seems to be slowing. It's not slowing. It seems to be spreading more slowly in the southern hemisphere. But we don't know for sure, right? We know Australia's got a substantial number of cases, but we know that Europe and North America are now the center. I mean, North America is the center now. New York City is certainly more cases in New York City than in Wuhan. But here's what we think, right? Is, and again, I met with the Surgeon General of the United States, who's the chief medical officer for our country, about 2.5 weeks ago. And he did say this is going to be a big deal. We need faith communities. It's going to be the biggest deal of our lifetime, and it has been. But there is still some possibility that this will will more strongly be evident in the northern hemisphere until the seasons switch. And then in the southern hemisphere, which has happened in the past, and then it cycles back around to the northern hemisphere. This is the cycle of seasonal flu. We all know this. So if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, you mentioned Zimbabwe, and this has not been widespread, it's probably coming. Now, again, maybe if you're in a place that's warmer, you wonder if it's going to come here. We don't know, but the south of Italy is pretty warm, and it's spreading a lot in such climates. So what I would say is I think you should assume it's coming. And again, phase 2, prepare and plan is where you need to be right now. So if you're not, like in our case in Chicagoland, we're one of the 5 major cities that are considered the next big wave, maybe a week away for us. So Chicagoland, we're full lockdown. We're what's called shelter in place. We're broadcasting. I'm the interim teaching pastor of a church called the Moody Church in Chicago. And I will tell you, it's surreal to speak in that auditorium, 3,750 seats in the heart of a downtown CBD commercial business district in Chicago. But it also reminds me that 100 years ago, Paul Rader was the pastor of Moody Church. And he preached through, and they served through, and they loved people through the Spanish flu epidemic. Again, with the mortality rate, we don't know for sure what the mortality rate is going to be, but we do know Spanish flu is higher by order of magnitude. So, and yet, that church is still there, right? So, and we're still going to be there, and we're still going to be showing and sharing the love of Jesus. Will there be some cost? Yes. Prepare, be ready. We're now hearing pastors. I know one pastor who's died in our community, several other pastors now sick family members and more. But this is what Christians have always done. And some of you are experiencing that now. You know that illnesses burn through a community, though probably nothing like this we've seen in 100 years. So what I would say is get ready, prepare your congregations, love your congregations, and then lead your congregations on mission into the community.
And as a pastor, as a church leader, in a sense, you're establishing the level of hope and the activity of faith for your people. It matters that pastor is able to express to his people and to his community the strength of the Lord, the presence of the Spirit to enable the church to move through this time and to serve the broader community. So in the end, Christ is honored.
Yeah, and I would say that for church leaders, whoever you might be, that again, coming back to that earlier reference, that I want the people to see the deeds of the Christians and glorify the God of the Christians. I think that's what you want as well. The reality is we can't do that by hiding away, which is what for a lot of people this virus has done, is forced us away from people. And one of the reasons that, 1,000 years ago, Christians, still met during plagues, and they still knew that there was some level that being close to one another spread a disease, but they still met. What we know is the difference between what we call exponential transmission. So getting 5 people in a room can quickly become 5,000 people, 5 people who are sick, and a larger group can quickly become 5,000 people sick. And so, but here's the thing at the end of the day. Again, I'm convinced this is our moment. And, Brian, you and I have talked about, we're friends, and we've talked about some of the evangelical reputation in the United States. And let me just say to all of you watching around the world, I'm sorry, I've done my best, but we have not helped a lot of the global movements with some of the reputation that we've earned and sometimes been assigned. But what I want, so one of the reasons I wrote that USA Today article, I said, this will show who we really are. And I hope that we'll discover that evangelicals in the United States are like evangelicals in the rest of the world, that our focus is not on me and mine. That's what people do in a crisis. They focus on me and mine. Everyone hoards things and more. But instead, our focus might be on Jesus and God's mission, that we might glorify God and we might join Jesus on mission. And I'm convinced that if we do those things, now, is it all going to be okay? It depends on what you mean okay. I tweeted a week before we recorded this, that this week you're going to know somebody who has coronavirus, who's diagnosed. And next month, you're going to probably know someone who died from it. And I think that's probably true. And where you are on the disease transmissions, cycle, I don't know. But you're probably going to know somebody who has it, and you're going to know somebody who dies from it. But here's the thing. I have hope. You have hope, right? We're not one of those who live or die without hope. And I've read the end of the book. Jesus wins. I just want to be a part of what he's doing in the world. The result of this cursed fall is disease and death, but Jesus has come and he's renewing all things, and he's calling men and women to follow him. And let's make much of Jesus. Let's show the love of Jesus through our deeds. Let's share the love of Jesus through our words. This is our moment.
Ed, thanks so much for your insights, for laying out these four stages that we can respond, how we can respond to the current issue. Ed Stetzer is director of the Billy Graham Center at Wheaton. Thank you for joining us today.